Hello. Hello, everybody. Hi. My name is Daniel Corral, and I'm Associate Director of SASSAS. And thank you guys for coming here a little bit early to listen to Mike Winter talk about this piece. There's a lot to absorb in the piece, so no one else would have as deep of insight into all the details of it as Mike would. So not really much more to say. I'm sure he'll tell us all about it. So thank you for being here, and let's give Michael Winter a round of applause.
So you guys are the brave to come an hour early to a long concert. So congratulations. Maybe get some rest now and get comfortable. There's really just a few things I want to do. I'm not going to talk too long because again, the music speaks for itself really, and it's best that we're kind of well rested before the concert. What I did want to do is kind of say, I'll do this at the end actually. I'm going to do reverse order for what I'm saying now. Kind of thank a few people who've been involved and talk a bit about the context of the piece, maybe in Jim's life and what was going around him at the time, and then get into the piece a little bit. And if you guys have questions, feel free to heckle, yell, whatever. So this is a pretty exciting event. This piece was written in 1985 and has now just recently been prepared for performance. So we're looking at a multi-decade process, and even the posthumous work itself was some 10 years. It's also an interesting piece because Jim was an incredibly humble and modest person, and he was a lover of music, and he was a wonderful teacher, and he spent a lot of his musical life kind of in the service of the people he was reverent towards. And, the classes, for example, that I took with him at Cal Arts, he did a year-long class about American musical mavericks, which really he made a point to not talk about people who were younger than him, with a few exceptions, and certainly not talk about himself. And then he also did a class on tuning, a year long, going, starting from the Greeks and moving all the way on into modern times with, some of the theories that are being explored these days. But it is one of the few cases where he wrote about a piece of his substantially. And I refer you to this very wonderful article called About Changes, which can say everything that I will say and more in a much clearer, well-written way. And I'm going to just read the opening passage from the article. He says here, "My intentions in this work were both exploratory and didactic. That is, I wanted to investigate the new harmonic resources that have become available through the concept of, quote, harmonic space, end quote, much more thoroughly than I had in any earlier work. At the same time, I wanted to explore these harmonic resources within a formal context which would clearly demonstrate certain theoretical ideas and compositional methods already developed in my computer music of the early 1960s, including the use of stochastic or constrained random processes applied to several holarchical perceptual levels, both monophonically and polyphonically. The references to the I-Ching, or the Book of Changes, in the titles of the individual studies derive from correlations which were made partly for poetic and philosophical reasons, but also, and perhaps more importantly, as a means of ensuring that all possible combinations of parametric states should be included in the work as a whole." Now, he makes a very interesting claim here, which I'll get into a bit further. He says, "I must confess that I frequently thought of the 24 preludes and fugues of J.S. Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier as a kind of model for what I wanted to do with the work. Although it seems highly unlikely that these studies themselves will ever betray that fact to the listener. So, you know, again, it's maybe, well, floor's fine. You know, it's in a way this really deep investigation, and my understanding of Jim's process is that he was really, you know, there was an ontology to composing for him. He was, you know, he was in a way a perpetual student. He used these explorations compositionally as a means to understand how we heard, how we hear, you know, understand how we interact as, you know, musical beings, as listeners. But I think, so he talks a bit about his work from the 1960s in computer music. So I'm going to give a little kind of brief history of James Tenney to contextualize this piece. So in the 60s, he worked at Bell Labs doing a lot of early computer music. In fact, I would say that he was probably the first or one of the first composers to write musical compositions with the aid of a digital computer. So of course electronic music had existed for a long time, but they had this, you know, computer system at Bell Labs, and they said we should get a composer to get in here and work with this, and the first person that held this position was James Tenney. So he really had a very deep interest in computer music and algorithmic composition up until, you know, through those years, and that interest continued throughout his life. But what was also interesting about Jim himself is that he had these different aspects of his life that really, superficially to others, could seem very disparate, but actually for him was his musical world. He would be in Bell Labs during the day working with the most modern technologies, you know, as a researcher, as a composer, and at night he was doing, you know, incredibly important performances in the New York scene. It was really, you know, and all of this fed into what you know, who he was becoming, and it's really an incredible history, his life. And if you track his life, you kind of get a glimpse of, you know, who's who in the music and art world. And he was really a person who fomented, you know, an incredible environment. After Bell Labs, you know, in the, I think it's the early 70s, maybe Rob or Lauren can tell me if I'm getting dates wrong because I'm kind of winging it. He came to teach at Cal Arts, north of here. And here he, you know, was around a bunch of wonderful musicians, but not necessarily big mainframe computers like they had at Bell Labs. And he started writing a lot of pieces for his friends that he was meeting at Cal Arts. Some of the well-known canonical pieces are called the Postal Pieces. It's a set of pieces on postcards dedicated to and for his colleagues at Cal Arts or his friends at Cal Arts and around the world. And they're these wonderfully open pieces, often with very minimal instructions. But again, the connections, you know, between computer music was never lost. Because I think when he was working with computers, he was thinking algorithmically, what are the variables, what's open? And those sorts of things, while not obvious on the surface of the Postal Pieces, I believe are still there. But the more important fact is he wasn't around computers. He didn't write computer music necessarily for many years. So then come around, fast forward, to 1985. He's teaching and living in Toronto. And there at York, they have a mainframe computer. And from 1985 on, a vast majority of his pieces are generated with the aid of a computer. But something that's very special about this piece that is actually, again, there are threads that run throughout his work up until his passing, is that everything he had done before gets integrated into this piece, as a sort of fabric in a very beautiful, elegant way. So another thing that happened in the years preceding, the years after Bell Labs and preceding the writing of this piece, is a very deep interest in harmony and what he calls harmonic space, an understanding of how tones are related to each other and how they're processed by the brain. Another, and then now to rewind a little bit, another very important work of Jim's is a book called Metahodos. This was his master's thesis, which has now become one of the most important theoretical works of the past 100 years. And what he did is he translated ideas in Gestalt psychology, perceptual, the formation of perceptual units, which was heavily based at the time in the early Gestalt psychology works, based on the domain of vision. How things are grouped. If they're close together, they're grouped. People group them in their minds, or if they share factors of similarity. And so again, the funny story here is he didn't need to write this master's thesis. His advisors, as far as I know the story goes, his advisors were like, this is really wonderful. You didn't need to do it. But again, it kind of shows his ambition to understand how it is that we hear. And what he talks about in Metahodos is this idea of hierarchical Gestalt formation, perceptual units, musically in time. And at the most fundamental level, there are elements, your kind of most atomic unit. Above that, elements group to form a clang. And several sequences of clang, several successive clangs form a sequence. And this can be taken hierarchically, so that clang on a sequence on one level might be a clang on the next hierarchical level. Anyway, back to changes. Where am I doing on time, actually? Maybe you cut me off at 1:30. And so changes integrates all of these things. All of these, and again, speaking towards Jim's ambition towards understanding music and how we hear, he wrote about all of these ideas as analytical tools. He was trying to understand, in a way that wasn't, that was aesthetically neutral, an understanding of how music is heard that is not genre-based, that can be applied to one music as much as the other. But what's interesting about this piece is this reverses all those analytical ideas over the years for a generative purpose. So now I'll just talk a little bit about things that are happening in the piece, which are not necessarily, I don't think it's important that you hear it this way, but for informative purposes, for me actually what I'll say right off the bat, some of the most the performance, I had the opportunity to hear the performance yesterday, and it's just an unbelievable feat of musicianship to play it, and it's very wonderful. And the things that happen, as hard as someone works at exacting an algorithm or understanding the compositional process, my guess is that at some point Jim had faith in his intuition for the algorithmic processes, but the things that happen are just absolutely musical, not in any sense removed from the musicianship that was very much in him. And you hear these, for example, wonderful explosion of very harmonic chords. And, it's that type of listening that I would encourage, without expectation, to kind of let the piece speak for itself. And it occasionally hits you pretty hard with respect to the consonances. But again, to talk about, just to go into the piece a little bit, and things that you might be able to hear, some less so than, or more so than others, is that obviously it is 64 pieces for 6 harps, tuned a 6th tone apart. Okay, so each of these harps is tuned a fraction of a semitone away from each other. And what you get, as opposed to our standard system now of 12-tone equal temperament, 12 tones per the octave, you get 72 tones per the octave. And Jim exploits this in multiple ways. One is to approximate harmonies, extended harmonies, because you have such small differences between the tones that he can get very close in some cases, almost exactly to target pitches that he's exploring that are typically, I'm not going to go into too much the theory of harmony, but based on prime numbers and how we break down the frequencies that are heard between the relationships of the tones. So there's this very deep, in-depth harmonic exploration. There's also the way that it's formulated structurally and morphologically based on what he calls temporal gestalt formation. So at the lowest level, the notes are the strings plucked, then they're grouped to create clangs, and then there are sequences of clangs. Now the I-Ching, I think, my Imagine, like he says, serves two purposes. One is there's this poetic aspect to the titles, and I would also assume that he was making homage to Cage, of whom he was deeply reverent and close with. But the I-Ching also served a very practical purposes. So the I-Ching is a set of 64 hexagrams. They are lines or broken lines, okay? And Jim broke these down into 3 diagrams. So you have 4 options for each diagram. 2 lines, unbroken, broken line, straight line, unbroken line, unbroken line, broken line, and 2 broken lines, or whichever one, it was the opposite from when I started. So 4. He mapped these to 4 parametric states. To 4 states of different parameters, including pitch range, things like temporal density. So what you'll hear, some of the pieces, it's really beautifully elegant. What you hear, some of the pieces start low, go high. Some start high, go into the middle range. Some stay in the full range all the time. So the 4 parametric states are essentially low, middle, high, and full. So full means the entire range of the harps. And what he does through each piece is constructed of 2 hexagrams that determine the start and end states of the parameters of the piece. So some start sparse and go denser. And what he does in this program is he kind of encourages a variety of these so that you can hear a lot of different types of transitions. Some are more static than each other. Some move quite quickly, and generally they're about 2 minutes apiece. And these are calculated based to preserve the temporal density that was dictated by the hexagrams. Another thing, and it's actually, I noticed that it's quite subtle in the piece, is that some of the studies, about 32, are monophonic. So you have to understand that the harps work like one big harp. It's one giant hocket. And in fact, in the score, if you implode the score, there's never a rest between the harps. The notes are always being passed around, and there are often chords. And some of the studies are monophonic, which means one line is passed around through all the harps. Half these studies are polyphonic, in which 2 lines are passed around through all the harps. And he does, if you have a chance to check out the score, which is beautifully displayed there in the back, you'll see, I don't know if it's a monophonic one or a polyphonic one, but the polyphonic ones have this really interesting thing where he preserves the top voice in the upper staff and the other voice in the lower staff, so you can kind of follow along each of the voices if you see the score. And how am I doing on time now? I'm sorry? Okay, I'm going to wrap up. I'm kind of reviewing the piece and the paper in my head. Like I said, the article is a very beautifully written article. And it's really, this piece is really to summarize, is really a testament to Jim's interests as a whole. Oh, I'll say one more thing. Again, this relation to the well-tempered clavier. So each of the pieces in this 72-tone set, like the preludes and fugues, has a different tonic. So it's cycling through different tonics. And he has these set of rules in the algorithm that preserve a sort of harmonic movement in each piece. So each piece starts and ends on a series of tones based on a root note, and through the process of the piece does kind of a harmonic walk, kind of modulating continually, as do the preludes and fugues. And in each of the clangs, in each of the groupings of notes, a different grouping of the 72-tone set is iterated. So in each clang you hear, and he has very strict rules about this. They're all based on stacked thirds. But you have to understand, in the 72-tone set, you have many different types of thirds, and thus you have exponentially more different types of chordal combinations. So you can have, a third that's a little bit higher, a major third that's a little bit higher, a major third that's a little bit lower, stacked on top with another major third that's of a different order. And so he explores all these combinations of these harmonic resources, as he says in the paper. And another thing that actually it's kind of one of the more subtle things in the paper, but it's something I was hearing a lot last night, is that actually these chords, which are these stacked thirds, at first are distributed pretty uniformly in the range of the instrument. For example, the thirds higher in the chord, that would be higher in the chord if you put them in order of stacked thirds, major third or minor third, perfect fifth, harmonic seventh, the 11th, the 13th on top of that, can kind of be inverted in various ways. But as each piece progresses, they are more likely, they have a higher tendency to be where you would hear them in kind of their root inversion. So you get towards the end of some of these pieces, like I said, these beautiful harmonic explosions where you have the harmonic seventh, which is slightly flat than a traditional temper note, really strongly heard in reference to its root note of that grouping of notes at the time. So again, he does this walk in harmonic space, constantly modulating, and then even though he's doing all these stochastic, constrained random processes, one thing that he enforces at the end of each piece is a quasi-traditional, maybe traditional is the wrong word, 5-1 cadence. The penultimate clang is always a perfect fifth above the ultimate clang. So you have, like in the music of Bach, this cadential ending of each of the pieces. I'm not going to say anything more. What I do want to say is, briefly, about the process of bringing this piece to fruition here for you tonight. I wrote a list. I apologize if this list is not complete, of people who participated in the possibility of us listening to the piece today. Susie Allen was an early harpist who came to us with the project. Casey Anderson, when he first started working on the project, was a young composer who had just graduated from Cal Arts. Rob Wanamaker was our decryptologist in residence for some of the printouts. Cassia Streb at the time was working with Lauren Pratt and was ultimately invaluable to the project. Larry Polanski, who is kind of a Tenny guru of sorts and a wonderful resource, and we were often bouncing ideas with him. John Myers, who's a composer who's now studying in Santa Cruz and was instrumental in finishing the final scores from which they're reading tonight. Of course, SASSAS, and Daniel Corral, who give them a big pat on the back because this was a huge amount of work for Daniel and Cindy. And then, of course, that leads us to the performers here, the conductor Nick Deyoe, Alison Bjorkedal, Ellie Choate, Elizabeth Huston, Catherine Jan Litaker, Amy Shulman, and Ruriko Terada. But I'm going to say this. I knew Jim to speak a little bit personally here. I had the great fortune of knowing Jim, the great opportunity of knowing Jim pretty much for the last 3 years of his life. And Jim's house was always a hotbed of incredible activity, musical, intellectual. He loved having his kids around, his family around, other musicians around. And his family, I would say, has been probably the most instrumental factor leading towards this performance and the dissemination of Jim's work in general. And if you had the opportunity to be with them all together, with Lauren and Justin and Adrian and Nathan and Miel, it was an incredibly stimulating environment to be in. And they were always talking about music, listening to music. Justin and Adrian and Nathan all had band practice in the garage. And again, this was part of Jim's world. And while I had the great opportunity to know Jim for 3 years, what's extended beyond that is their family, who I really feel has really always treated me as one of theirs, and many, many other people. And so I'm very thankful for that relationship that has continued on for many years. And many of them are here today, and thank you guys. And I think that's it. Enjoy the performance. Get a rest for 30 minutes or so. Oh, and cheers to the performers and everyone and the family and SASSAS. Thank you.